until 2018, as my graph showed, average wages kept ahead of the poverty datum line. But in the last 2 years, we have a dangerous gap that has opened up. And by now, the PDL is about 3 times the average wage. And that excludes informal sector and agriculture. And if you include them on the wage calculation, then the gap is much higher. If we turn to the monetary side, government is going to have to print lots of money. It's denying it, but it's going to have to happen because there's no other way. If you look at what's happening in the US or Europe or the UK or South Africa, all of these countries are expanding their money supplies very rapidly. And that results in a weaker currency and higher inflation. Money supply is probably, by now, June, up about 120%. Light years ahead of the RBZ target of only 15%. What does that mean for inflation? Well, next month, or the figure that we'll get in the middle of this month, 2 weeks' time roughly, will be for June, and it will show probably a decline in the annual rate of inflation. That may surprise you. But the reason for that is that last year we had a very large increase in the inflation rate. We had 39.3% in the month of June. I would hope that we won't have anything as bad as that this year. So we'd see the average annual rate reduce somewhat. Thereafter, the hope is that inflation fluctuates to around the 700% level, where it is now. The probabilities, I'm afraid, are very strongly against that. And that the worst case scenario that I talked about of around 1,000 by the end of the year, 1,000%, is very realistic. Arguably, the exchange rate is far and away the most important indicator. And if this cannot be managed, and the authorities have failed miserably so far, inflation will remain unsustainably high, social and political problems will intensify, along with further economic deterioration. The government is pinning its hopes on the auction. So far, in 2 auctions, the exchange rate has depreciated another 60%, and the Zimbabwe dollar, as I said, theoretically worth 100 cents 18 months ago, is now worth 1.5, slightly more than 1.5. New restrictions on mobile platforms imposed this last weekend and the closure of the stock exchange illustrate how close government is to running out of road, to running out of options. Bankruptcy. Very little attention is paid in the media to the threat of bankruptcy. All the media goes on about is inflation and exchange rates. Bankruptcy, they don't seem to care. CBZ Bank, for instance, the country's biggest bank, revealed the other day that it has $400 million in legacy debt with the RBZ. Now that exceeds CBZ's market capitalization. In Zim dollar terms, it translates to about 28 billion, which is about double the net asset base of the central bank. Yet the central bank is guaranteed to repay it. So you have to ask how. There are many firms with substantial offshore liabilities in US dollars, which have grown up or accumulated over a long period. If you convert those into local currency at the official rate, don't worry about the parallel rate, they would be overwhelmed. The country's foreign debt is about $9 billion US. That is about 570 billion Zimbabwe dollars at the current time, or well over the GDP, which may be at very best 450 to 500 billion. Now, although they must be fully aware of this situation, the authorities cannot acknowledge that their game plan has failed. And there has to be a plan B. Unfortunately, there doesn't appear to be one, which is why the present strategy is to reiterate again and again that reform is working and that the results will show later this year. That's exactly what Mtuli was saying a year ago. Give us time and you'll see the results. Well, we're still waiting. Bizarrely, government is apparently willing to take on another 3.5 billion in foreign debt, US dollars, to compensate some 3,300 white farmers. Now, it might make political sense. Some of us don't think it does, but it certainly doesn't make economic sense because it would take our debt to GDP ratio to 160%. So let me wind up. What to expect? The decline will continue. Poverty and unemployment will get worse. Inflation will accelerate, escalate. The exchange rate continue to decline. The debt crisis will get rapidly worse. And we face a deteriorating social and political climate. That means the current unsustainable situation will not last. So there are two conclusions. We must have some kind of economic and financial bailout, which will have tough and economic and political conditionalities that the present government will be unable to accept. The second is that the exchange rate strategy that continues to fail must be replaced by re-dollarization. Corporate strategy today in Zimbabwe is about surviving, and the next year is going to be very tough. Unless government compromises on its political stance, the economic slide will continue right through next year, which raises the question, how much longer do people face food shortages, unemployment, privation, falling incomes, and so on? HR professionals, such as the people on this platform, are caught in the middle. I feel sorry for you. You're trying to balance worker demands and skills retention with collapsing real incomes and management's insistence on cost cutting. It will get tougher before it gets better. And the realistic approach is to take a one-year view and say, we've got to batten down the hatches for the next 12 months and hope for better days thereafter. It's a very delicate balance, especially when real wages are falling along with employment in the formal economy. Nor from the scenarios presented is an improvement likely before mid-2021 at the earliest, which is why short-term survival precedes any kind of long-term strategic planning. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Prof. I'll open up the session for questions. If to the participants, if you have any questions, please raise up your hand and we'll allow you to ask your question. Questions? Any questions? Yes, Levi. Hello?
Okay. My question is on the auction system. I just want to understand something. How do auctions work? Because it appears we have an auction system that's working on the basis of an average. To say yesterday we had an auction, then there is now an average of 63.74. My understanding was auctions work on the basis of. So how is this auction system working on the basis of an average when it's supposed to be working on the basis of an highest bid?
Okay, yep, thank you. Can I take another question before?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you, Levi. Your question has been noted.
Hello, Memory?
Yes, your question has been noted. I'll ask Prof to respond. Okay, Prof, maybe you can respond to that question while you're waiting for others.
Okay.
All right. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you clearly.
Oh, good. Fine. Look, it's called a Dutch auction system. By that, what happens is somebody goes in, as we saw yesterday. I've just got the paper here, and it says that the highest rate was 92, and the lowest rate was 37.8. Now, what that means is the people who bid at the highest rate, or the person who bids at the highest rate, gets what he asked for, or gets allocated most of what he asked for at that price. So he pays 92. The guy who comes in at the lowest rate, if he gets any at all, gets it at 37.8 yesterday. And the average, if you work all that out, we don't know how many bids there were, it hasn't been published. Your average, as you work it out, is 63.7. So the way it works, if you want to be sure you're going to get your money, you bid high. But that means you pay higher. The irony about it is that we know government wants to keep the rate as low as possible. So you have this bizarre situation where the seller of foreign exchange, i.e. government, is trying to keep the price down. It's a bit odd, but that's the way it works.
Okay. We've got a few questions on the chat here. Thanks for the presentation, Prof. Can you shed more light on the political stance that the present government is holding on to, which will not release positive economic development?
Yeah, well,
maybe before, Karen, I can then ask that.
Yeah, it's easy to answer a question at a time. I think, I'm not a political animal. I'm an economist. All I'm saying is that the international community is not interested in relieving Zimbabwe of its debt obligations, which are very severe and that I've been arguing unsustainable. So long as the current political situation is in place. So there has to be some kind of reforms undertaken by government here to be able to re-grease or reopen what I call unclog the wheels of international re-engagement and international cooperation. I think only when we've done that will it be possible. You see, we cannot move as a country until we have got an agreement with the IMF. And if that's not available, then no one's going to be putting any money in the direction of Zimbabwe.
Okay, there's another question here. What's Prof's advice to the HR professional that is caught in the middle? We have demands for USD or USD rated salaries, but the business can't sustain that. What do we do? How do we advise both management and staff that look at us for advice?
Well, thank you, but I wish I knew the answer to that. I mean, I do. I think everyone is in the same sort of boat, and a lot of people must be very angry with government in the private sector, must be very angry with government for having agreed to give this what they call COVID allowance, which is not in dollars, as we know. It's called dollars, but it's going to be paid into a Nostra account from which you cannot withdraw dollars. You can make payments from it, allegedly at the dollar auction rate, but you cannot actually draw the green folding stuff and walk around the corner to the bureau and change it at a much higher rate. Now, everybody's in the same boat. If you're not an exporter, as the questioner rightly says, you really are in a very tough position. You've got to then go and find free funds, i.e. bring money into the country yourself, which you may not be able to do, probably can't do, or you have to go to the parallel market, because the auction will say, no, 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 you're not a priority, off you go. Mm. So, you know, the only sort of comfort one can get in this situation is that we're going to have to go back to the US dollar sooner rather than later. And when that happens, we're all in the same boat. But until then, I do think you've got a very tough situation. All you can say to the workforce is, sorry, guys, we don't earn dollars, we can't pay you dollars. Mm-hmm. And I'm sure employees would recognize that reality.
Mm-hmm. Yep, let's take another question. Say, Prof, there's been a huge jump in the amount of money spent by the government on subsidies. How sustainable are the subsidies?
Well, I don't think they're sustainable, but you can understand government policy because it's trying to hold down wages, trying to cushion people against rising prices. Subsidies are a way out, but subsidies, as we all know, are a very inefficient way out. It means you're subsidizing the price of roller meal or whatever. Fuel, we've been subsidizing all the time, local currency. You're subsidizing everyone. So in other words, the chefs driving in their smart 2022 Mercedes are able to buy roller meal at the same price as a guy who's living below the breadline. So subsidies are no use. They've got to be targeted on the people who really need it. And that's a very difficult thing to do from an administrative viewpoint. Subsidies are just a holding strategy. Government obviously hopes that, well, it spends its life hoping that the exchange rate is going to stabilize, prices are going to stabilize. And that's the way to go. Once you stabilize prices, then you can, people will be able to earn enough eventually to be able to do away with subsidies. But you're perfectly right. By having subsidies means you have to print money to finance them, which in turn will make inflation worse, and the subsidies even greater. So it's a losing game before you start.
Okay, thank you, Prof. This question says, Prof, may you please explain why the government took a stance to close the ZSE and what the long-term effect of this will be on economic recovery? Was it a wise decision?
No, it was a panicky decision. The logic so far, if there is any logic, is government was claiming that just as Gideon Gono did in 2018 when he closed the stock exchange. It's not the first time Zimbabwe has done it. We're probably the only country in the world to have done it twice in 20 years or 12 years or however many years it is. The aim is to stop people from putting spare cash into the stock market. The government wants them to keep the cash and invest in government securities. Government announced yesterday that they're planning to issue bonds to people at 5%, so you'll get interest rate of 5%, but the bonds, they say, will be indexed against the auction rate. So in other words, as the currency devalues, so the value of your bond goes up. But you only get 5% interest, and 5% interest over a year. 5% interest when inflation is 800% is not exactly an attractive investment. The stock exchange is a much more attractive investment. Now, what's the long-term effect? Personally, I don't think they'll be able to keep the exchange closed for long. they will realize in a relatively short time that that doesn't work. Remember, in Gona's case, the exchange was closed in November and the dollar collapsed in January and we had a new currency. So you might take the view that that's an indicator that we're moving very rapidly towards a new currency. I don't think they can sustain it for long. It does a lot of damage internationally. It shows the country to be financially unstable, and it's a very unrewarding policy. I can't believe that. I've read Minister Nube's defense, where all he would say was, look, your money will be safe. He's talking nonsense, of course, which he does a lot of the time, because your money is at the share price you have for your Delta or your InScore or whatever was set last Friday before they closed it. And as more and more inflation goes on, the value of your shares goes down. So when the minister claims that, he's not telling the truth.
Okay, thank you. Let me go to other questions. For some reason, Prof did not deal with the issue of corruption, or did I miss that? What is the size of corruption?
No, you're quite right. I didn't deal with corruption. I know, I read an awful lot about corruption, but I have no first-hand knowledge. A lot of what I read turns out to be untrue or semi-true or half-true and so on. That it is a perception problem. Zimbabwe is perceived to be a highly corrupt country. Yes, I know that. But there's someone like myself can't really comment on it because I just don't know enough about it. Okay. We have a anti-corruption commission, which is allegedly pursuing people. Seems to me to be pursuing people for political reasons rather than other ones. But that's another matter. I'm afraid it is an issue. It certainly is a deterrent to investment. And more than that, it attracts the wrong kind of investors. You do tend to get in a corrupt country, you tend to attract corrupt investors.
Okay. Then, Prof, you commented that remote work is inherently inefficient. This is another question. Do you mean there is no room for that development in line with international trends for Zimbabwe?
Sorry, I didn't get that. What's inherently inefficient? Working from home?
Yes.
Well, I think it's a problem for everybody. Even doing a Zoom presentation as I'm doing now, and we had to interrupt it for 15 minutes because there was a technical problem. Now, this happens all the time. I find that I do conference calls with people and so on, but you're talking sometimes to a whole lot of people. You don't really get a sense of how they're responding or reacting because you don't see them and so on and so on. I think it makes things less efficient, and I think it reduces productivity. And obviously not everybody can work from home. If you're working in a factory or you're on a building site or you're running a hotel, you can't work from home. Working from home is okay for a limited number of people in a highly technologically advanced economy where you can use lots of gimmicks and so on like we're using today. But I hope it's not a lasting strategy. I hope it's not a permanent strategy.
Yeah, there's Henry. You want to ask a question? Please proceed.
Thank you, Memory. Prof, with the auction system as it stands now, how can it be improved so that the average price reflects the correct market perception?
Well, I think that the best way to make an auction work is to free it up completely. And we haven't done that. We have a situation where there are, I think, perhaps two critical problems. The first one is imports are, you can only bid if your product is on the priority list. If it's low down the priority list, you're not going to get your money. So that, as I was saying in response to an earlier question, means you're going to go straight to the parallel market, because why waste your time in the official market? The second problem is the question of the issue of surrender requirements. And that brings up all the issues we've been talking about today. You're telling the tobacco farmer or the gold exporter, gold miner, and other miners and other industrialists who export, you're telling them that some of their currency must go to government at some artificial exchange rate rather than the market exchange rate. And that means that you are deterring and exports, but you're also restricting the availability of foreign currency in the marketplace. And at the end of the day, the whole question of this auction comes back to government wanting, or the Reserve Bank wanting to control the exchange rate. It doesn't want the exchange rate to be controlled by you and I buying and selling exchange to each other. No, no, no. It has to be done through government. Government has to somehow be controlling it. And that is the problem.
Okay. Henry, are you answered?
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other question from the other participants? Okay, there's a question here. Do you agree that ultimately Zimbabwe's salvation can only come from a definitive political settlement? Is ZANU-PF really capable of reform, or is a political settlement really shorthand for change of government?
I certainly agree with the first point that there has to be some kind of political accommodation. And not being a political analyst, there's so many political analysts, you read them all, particularly in the independent newspaper. They have 532 of them every week. Most of them appear to know very little about politics, but we won't go there. I certainly agree that there has to be some kind of political accommodation. As for, which party is the right one, or which governments or whatever, I can't comment on that. All I can say is that you've got to have a consensus on the way ahead. And one thing we don't have in Zimbabwe is any kind of consensus on the way ahead. We do have a somewhat polarized situation. And then you do have to have some idea of people feeling that government is working for everyone. And a lot of people, myself included, get the impression government is working for itself and not for the ordinary Joe in the street.
Okay. Then there's another question. I think we'll take 3 or 4 more, then we end, Prof, in the interest of time. The auction system uses a priority list which leave other economic players in need of US dollars to go to the black market. Why did the government not use the rate system it had initially proposed? It seemed to be a better mechanism than a weekly auction.
Sorry, which system had it proposed? I didn't get
the Reuters system.
The Reuters system.
Yeah.
Oh, well, they are using the Reuters system as a basis for the
bids
trading outside the auction. In other words, from auction to auction, we're supposed to trade at that rate. For instance, the rate was set yesterday at 63 or whatever, and it's got to stay there until next Tuesday. And so any trades are being done via the Reuters system. The Reuters system is just putting your details onto the computer and so on, screen. It wasn't working really in the sense, we only had it for about a week, remember, and then they went to the official rate of 25 in March. The problem ultimately is there's not enough the 2 things which I did talk about in my talk. 1, there's not enough foreign exchange. Demand is greater than supply. And 2, there's no confidence. People do not want to hold the local currency. If you ask every one of us on this platform, do we want to put US dollars into our account, or do we want to put Zim bonds into our account? We all know that answer. And so, I'm afraid that's a very difficult issue to try and have a meaningful currency auction against that kind of background.
Okay. Any other question? Any other question that people may have? You can put your question on the chat. We'll just take 2-3 more questions, then we are done. Okay, Prof, I think it seems there are no questions. I would like to thank you very much for agreeing to be part of this particular session.